After my father cheated, I plotted with my sister to take his house and savings. The reunion ended with him stripped of respect and wealth. This entire situation unfolded a year ago, but the aftermath persists, and I wish for it to continue until the day that man passes away. This will be a lengthy account, so prepare yourself. Edit acknowledgement to Royal AI for reading and creating a visual representation of my story. Be sure to check it out. Background: throughout my childhood, my sister and I held no affection for our father. I will spare you the exhaustive details, but suffice it to say that alcoholic, abusive, and violent are just a few terms that come to mind. When my sister got accepted into a significantly better, albeit farther, high school than the one in our hometown, she relocated immediately and seldom returned to visit. We had a 10-year age gap, and at that time, I was only 4. For many years, I harbored resentment towards her for abandoning me to face the burdens of our father alone, but I have since come to understand her choices better, and we now share a positive relationship. Our local factory was so immense that it employed nearly everyone in the town. Consequently, everyone was acquainted with each other. This included my parents. But then the factory was acquired by the Defense Department, which initiated layoffs for personnel who did not possess at least a high school diploma. My mother faced termination a mere 4 months after my birth. Conversely, my father managed to remain employed until retirement, receiving military status. Essentially, they conferred upon him an honorable designation to almost double his pension, but he was also expected to conduct himself in accordance with military standards, particularly in speech. My childhood was filled with trauma, so it is no surprise that I grew into a troubled individual. Anger issues and mental health instability have been particularly challenging, and I am still making progress on those fronts. Upon turning 18, I enlisted in the military. There were 2 significant advantages: it was financially free, and I could choose to remain away from home indefinitely. For me, it was genuinely an escape from a living nightmare. Fast forward 3 years, I received an honorable discharge. It turned out I had genuine mental health issues. Who would have guessed? I received a substantial amount of money and additional funds in the following months after my military insurance was processed. Upon returning home, I found my town to be underwhelming, and my father had not changed in the slightest. Not wanting to spend the rest of my life in that place, I gathered what I could and relocated to the city where my sister resided. The last thing my father said to me was, "You will never succeed," because apparently, being discharged for a mental health condition meant I was a coward. I also suspect he disliked the fact that I had become stronger than the boy who had once obeyed him without question, and that I stood up for myself during the few weeks I spent with him, more than I had in the first 18 years of my life. I settled into a new environment, obtained a blue-collar job. I had become quite muscular thanks to the military, and decided to pursue a career in information technology while prioritizing my mental health. When it all started during this period, my father was diagnosed with cancer. I was informed that it was not life-threatening, but required surgical procedures. A few years prior, my sister had mended her relationship with him partially due to my mother and would occasionally bring my niece to visit. Since she was quite successful, she decided to cover all the costs for his surgeries, treatment, and hospital stays, all while simultaneously moving into a new home and purchasing her first vehicle, which is quite costly in my country. Though my father possessed a substantial bank account due to his pension, he did not have to contribute a single penny. After about a year, he was in recovery, and overall, things seemed positive. Meanwhile, I was struggling to balance work and study, living paycheck to paycheck, and relying on social programs for my treatment. I visited him after each surgery, yet the encounters were never emotional. As long as he didn't provoke me, I was fine. Nearly a year after staying at my sister's home, my parents returned home after his doctor gave the go-ahead. At that time, I was seeking a new job because my current position was dreadful and worsening my mental health. Fortunately, I found a role that utilized most of my skills and allowed me enough time to complete my studies. One day, my mother called, distressed and tearful, asking me to return home that weekend. She informed me that my father had been seeing someone else. While I could not dismiss the man's character, I initially thought my mother was being paranoid, a tendency she still exhibits today, and I resented the idea of making a 4-hour journey for what seemed trivial. So I reassured her and pushed the matter aside. A few months later, I received another phone call, this time from my sister. She visited that week, bringing my niece along to reveal that she was 3 months pregnant. Instead of a joyous occasion, it quickly turned into chaos. My father had left his phone unattended for a few minutes, during which his mistress sent him a rather provocative photograph, which my mother saw. Of course, this led to chaos. My sister mentioned it was the first time in years she witnessed my mother screaming at my father, and when he attempted to hit her, my sister intervened, prompting her husband to step in as well, since she was, after all, 3 months pregnant. The situation culminated in a tearful return to our city after hours of mutual insults. The only silver lining was that my mother was able to retrieve his phone. We persuaded my mother to pursue a divorce, but she had always been a submissive housewife who believed divorces were more horrific than torturing puppies, and at that time, she still harbored some hope that he might change. After almost 35 years together, I figured there must have been something worth salvaging. She was unwilling to proceed, so we chose to cut him out of our lives for good. Lo and behold, 6 months after the incident, my father's relatives began reaching out to me. I enforce a strict no-call policy, allowing only my mother, my sister, her husband, 3 close friends, and more recently, my boyfriend to contact me outside of work hours. To my surprise, my father, his sister, my aunt, and my grandmother all reached out within a single day. They suddenly adopted a friendly demeanor and attempted to persuade me to visit them. Clearly, it was all a facade. After the incident, my father's family assigned blame to my mother, asserting that she should have kept the affair secret instead of causing turmoil for the family's sake. They also disavowed my sister and me, deeming us ungrateful children when we refused to accept their final defense. He's still your father, after all. Driven by morbid curiosity, I ventured back alone to discover the purpose of their outreach. It turned out they wanted to sell his house, which was located on my grandmother's property. Before my father's first surgery, we were uncertain about the outcome, so he transferred the house to my name, as inheriting a deceased person's estate in my country can be extremely complicated. For convenience's sake, we also persuaded my grandmother to give me the land, as she was elderly, 80 at the time. This arrangement had been made when relations were amicable, and I knew they would much rather suffer than revisit such negotiations a year later. I sensed something was amiss, something I could not quite identify, but I knew it was there. I told them politely that I would consider their request and promptly departed under the guise of an emergency. A plan began to formulate in my mind during my drive home, and for the first time in a while, I found myself smiling. I went directly to my sister's house, since my mother was staying with her, and laid out the plan. After a year of living in the city, my mother had adopted a more open-minded perspective, and it didn't take much convincing for her to agree. The plan my sister consulted a lawyer to explore our legal options. Since both the house and the land were in my name, my father's family had no claim to them. Any document lacking my signature would be deemed invalid in the eyes of the law. They could attempt to claim the property was rented, but that would require them to move far away, hoping I would lose track of them, which I knew would be too complex a task for 2 elderly individuals. They might argue it represented his life's work, but since he and my mother were never divorced, it was technically also half hers. That's when I devised an idea. I asked the lawyer how my mother filing for divorce would impact things, and he indicated that it was unlikely the court would grant her a substantial claim unless we could prove his infidelity prior to the separation. To his surprise, I had the evidence. Remember the phone my mother had retrieved that day? Although it was damaged during the confrontation, it remained largely intact. She had insisted I discard it a few days later, but my laziness led me to stash it away in my loft instead. Suffice to say, it provided us with more than adequate evidence of his betrayal. The execution after assessing our options, I contacted my father to inform him that I would be returning the following month to make an announcement. He was keen to hear what it was. Upon my arrival, they were extraordinarily pleasant, but when I introduced my lawyer, their demeanor shifted dramatically to hostility and aggression. I presented my father with 2 alternatives: relinquish any claim to the house or face a lawsuit. In my country, marital offenses carry a minimum probation period of 6 months, extending up to 2 years in prison. After a lengthy exchange of accusations and foul language, he kicked us out, leading me to assume he opted for the latter. At the initial hearing, my mother, lawyer, and I were present. It transpired to be another screaming match, with my father fabricating numerous lies about my mother. At one point, my lawyer leaned in to suggest that if the judge did not intervene soon, it was possible that they had a personal relationship, and he encouraged me to allow him to take charge. The judge informed us that this case was not a priority, the processing could extend for months, and that we would find the paperwork cumbersome. He recommended reaching an out-of-court settlement. My lawyer politely declined and warned my father to anticipate another hearing soon, under less favorable conditions. My father made one last attempt to rally his relatives, painting my mother as the villain and me as an ungrateful child, hoping to apply pressure on us. Very few relatives sided with him, and even if they all had, I would not have allowed him to escape without consequences. By the second hearing, he finally relented and consented to my terms, which entailed his surrendering any claim to the house and formally divorcing my mother. In essence, my mother alone now held legitimate rights to the property. I agreed to permit him to live there for the remainder of his life, but not with anyone else, specifically his mistress with whom he had been cohabitating. The revenge. This marked the commencement of my plans. First, my sister compiled all medical bills that she had covered for his treatment. Although a few receipts were missing, we managed to create an extensive file. Learning just how costly cancer treatments could be was quite a shock to me, certainly not something I relish. Once we ascertained the total amount he should owe us, we pursued the necessary legal steps. This was considered highly unethical in my country, as children are normally expected to care for aging parents, but we had long since set aside such expectations. We understood it was not a criminal matter, so we proceeded to small claims court, subsequently sending bailiffs to collect the debts. This lady exhibited an "I don't care" attitude, and when he failed to comply, she dispatched the police to begin confiscating assets. This meant bidding farewell to wooden furnishings, a 27-inch smart television, a refrigerator, and a reclining massage chair, all of which had been purchased by my sister as well. He was forced to pay out of pocket because the bailiff insisted on seizing anything he purchased until she received full payment. Although the final amount was halved, my mother, under legal guidelines, was entitled to half for some reason. It still depleted 70% of his savings. Of course, this was not solely about the money, we were simply seeking to make a point. We advised the moving company they could dispose of the furniture as they saw fit. Looking back, I should have taken the recliner, as my back is constantly in pain even though I am only in my late 20s. Once this was completed, I contacted my local factory to file a report. Remember his generous pension, which had been contingent upon his good behavior. It was clear he had strayed from that agreement. Although everyone knew everyone else in the small town, no one had ever reported him, but that was no longer the case. I provided them with a meticulously compiled file of evidence, including images from his phone pictures that could only be described as explicit. They expeditiously arranged a hearing, and he was stripped of his rank, resulting in his pension being reduced to just over half of what it originally was. I know this because the elderly love to gossip, and my mother is no exception. She was elated to hear the news. It was her primary topic of conversation for an entire month. Just as I thought I was concluded with this ordeal, a week later, my sister informed me that my aunt appeared at her doorstep to chastise her and her children. My sister was working from home that day, while my mother was out for some reason. My sister promptly called security to have my aunt removed and alerted me that she might come after me next. I was furious not because of some obstinate relative causing me minor inconveniences, but because she was yelling at my niece and nephew. As a gay man, I feel deeply connected to the idea of legacy, so I pour all my affection into those children. Had I been present, I would have lost it on her. I conducted some digging and discovered that my aunt was in significant financial distress. She had hoped to extract money from my father, whether through the sale of the house or from his substantial bank account. Since neither option was viable, she shifted her anger onto my sister. Do you want to understand what determination fueled by rage can achieve? Although I never cultivated an online presence, mainly because I couldn't afford a phone until I turned 18 and the military taught me it wasn't necessary, I made an exception for this specific occasion. I created a Facebook account and sent her a friend request. I didn't need to masquerade as someone else. Older individuals tend to accept friend requests indiscriminately. She projected an image of wealth and opulence through her selfies, presenting herself as affluent. From what I gathered from my mother and her gossip network, she consistently informed her creditors that she was financially struggling. This led me to believe she must have been blocking their calls. The next steps were straightforward. I simply forwarded all her selfies to her creditors. I didn't have to reveal my identity, given that I was merely using a throwaway account, which resulted in a lengthy string of messages exposing my aunt's lavish lifestyle amidst her financial woes. In the month that followed, she faced intimidation not with legal threats like I had executed, but through much more menacing methods. Thugs, not police officers, began leaving gifts on her doorstep, items such as paint, fish sauce, and occasionally, literal excrement. My mother kept me updated, of course. She finally understood my intentions when I instructed her to compile a list of all the individuals to whom my aunt owed money. The revenge, though I want to claim credit for the brilliance of this idea, it was not my original concept. Forgive me as I provide a bit more background. My father's family is quite traditional, with a designated head of the family making decisions on important matters. This practice ceased to exist during wartime, but the head still holds a certain authority, and each year we gather to pay tribute to our ancestors. During this ceremony, the family head delivers a speech accompanied by announcements about births, deaths, marriages, and the like. Following the formalities, a celebratory feast allows us to indulge in revelry. My great-grandfather assumed the role of head, followed by my grandfather, then my father, and now, me. This segment of the family resides in a town 3 hours from ours, as my grandfather moved there seeking opportunity when he became the head of the family, expecting it to be held by someone else. I found these gatherings tiresome and unnecessary, but that year I was actually excited about attending. My father attempted to keep the date a secret. It fluctuated, but generally occurred around June, but he seriously underestimated my mother's network of connections. She doesn't have merely a gossip circle, she possesses an infinite number. Therefore, my mother, my sister, and her family all returned for the event. The trip was grueling, totaling 14 hours, but the outcome justified the effort. We devised a plan to arrive 2 days before my father, thanks to my mother's network. His extended family had never heard the full story, they only knew his version, which painted my mother as abandoning him. I must admit my father excelled at keeping quiet about my mother's grievances. As we weighed the pros and cons, we decided to allow my mother to recount her experience, a feat at which she excels. I am not joking. If I had posted her story verbatim, a global movement for justice in her name would have likely arisen within a week. By the end of the day, everyone was informed of my father's unethical behavior. The look on his face when he arrived, alongside my aunt and grandmother, to find my family already present was priceless. He received cold stares for the remainder of the event, as no one initiated small talk with him. He was left to sulk like a defeated dog. Though many believe it's improper to kick a man when he's down, this notion was far too clever to abandon. My uncle, whom we will refer to as Oliver, is my father's equal in familial standing, and should my father's lineage fail to produce a male heir, which is undoubtedly the case, his branch would inherit the mantle. He suggested I take over as the head of our family. This was unexpected, as I hadn't prepared a speech. My father was meant to handle that. Yet, Oliver assured me I could simply express whatever I wished because no one truly paid attention to those speeches anyway. The other elders concurred. The announcement was just the beginning. At the celebratory feast, seating would be arranged according to the family tree. Heads of each branch congregate, their descendants sit together, and the elders have separate seating. As I had been elevated to head of my branch, I was now at the prestigious table. My father, however, was denied a seat at this table, as it was suddenly full, despite my conviction that there were not 20 people present and each table could accommodate up to 10. He ended up at the standard table, alongside my aunt and a group of bitter widows who were more than willing to share their disparaging remarks, or so I was told. I doubt he will ever return to one of those gatherings again. The aftermath: my father has since become a miserable elderly man. His mistress departed from him, having seemingly pursued him solely for his financial resources. He now resides in our old house with virtually nothing left. Although his pension was diminished, it remains considerable enough to sustain him. The latest news I received indicated that his cancer has returned, and predictably, my sister will no longer foot the bill for his treatment. He has attempted to contact my mother, seeking reconciliation, but we had to block his phone number and remove him from her social media accounts, as she entertained the notion of engagement. Deep down, she still possesses a lingering softness. My aunt was compelled to sell her home to settle her debts, or the threats would persist. She now occupies a small house purchased with her remaining funds. I feel a semblance of sympathy for her husband. He is genuinely amiable, yet lacks decisiveness, resulting in him failing to confront her. I sincerely hope he is managing well. However, I hold no compassion for her only son. Let's just say he resembles her far too closely. How do I know all these details? My mother's gossip network. I intentionally overlooked my grandmother in this narrative. She is quite advanced in age but remains mentally sharp. However, she loved my father too deeply to acknowledge his faults. Additionally, she was very sweet to me during my upbringing, and many of my cherished memories involve her. I mourn the fact that she does not see my mother in the same light. I have ceased communication with her and plan only to visit once during the Lunar New Year. She continues to live in the small house that she and my grandfather constructed, situated on the land that now belongs to me. Upon her and my father's passing, I intend to fulfill her wishes to create an altar in honor of her and my grandfather, while whether or not my father will be included remains a contentious topic. Summary: my father was unfaithful to my mother, which led to me seizing his house, his savings, and reshaping his social circle. To clarify, none of this would have transpired had he conducted himself with honesty. He could have summoned us all, declared his intentions to separate from my mother, and I would have been indifferent. Instead, he resorted to threats and violence, prompting my actions in retaliation. Additionally, I deleted that Facebook account. I may be reckless, but I am not that reckless. Edit: I will revise the summary. Furthermore, I appreciate the kind strangers for the award. In reference to the small claims court, as previously indicated, these claims are deemed highly unethical in my country, and the law allows for various interpretations. You merely need to prove that someone owes you money for any reason. The sum does not need to be significant. I made it appear effortless, but in reality, we endured 3 different hearings. The judge advised us to pursue an out-of-court settlement during the initial 2 sessions since my father was absent. It ultimately took nearly a year before our claim was acknowledged. My sister gave birth to my nephew around that time. In summary, we identified a loophole and capitalized on it. Additionally, yes, I am Vietnamese. Infidelity is unequivocally a criminal act here. In fact, this is the first instance I have encountered where it is not regarded as such elsewhere, so I express gratitude to Reddit for this newfound enlightenment. Lastly, it is evident that this was not an impulsive decision. I thoroughly contemplated it, considering preparations for potential complications. However, nothing was finalized due to my mother's opposition. We did not simply awaken one day and resolve to wreak havoc. Story 2. I took 87 weeks off unexpectedly, then struck a deal to train my own replacements. While the CEO fumed then, I launched my own company. A family acquaintance was employed at the same company from the age of 26 until he was 64, when the situation described below commenced. I obtained his consent to recount this story, although I am not revealing specific details to maintain his anonymity and generality. One significant issue was the government laws in the country that raised the retirement age from 62 to 65 when he was in his early to mid-50s, and then again from 65 to 67 when he reached approximately 62 or 63. The previous owners operated as a family-run business, providing benefits to their employees. From what I have been informed, they offered an additional week of vacation after every 6 years of service. Thus, in addition to the standard 4 weeks of vacation, he accumulated an extra 6 weeks during the events described. Employees also had access to 2 weeks of remote work when their job permitted, or an extra week off for those unable to take it. Consequently, he enjoyed 11 weeks off each year. Moreover, the family owners permitted employees aged 55 and older to utilize their vacation time as they wished, whether all at once, with about 2 weeks' notice, which was merely a courtesy, according to him, in segments, or even to forego it and accumulate time to be used later during retirement. Another challenge in our country is that when one submits retirement paperwork to the government, the process can take an incredibly long time. It is not uncommon for it to exceed 2 years for the authorities to determine your benefits and begin dispersing payments. Of course, they eventually compensate for that time, but it remains a significant issue. During the delay, individuals receive only the minimum pension amount. However, he had approximately 44 years of experience and more ahead of him as a well-compensated engineer, which meant a substantial retirement income. Thus, the owners allowed employees to accumulate their vacation time and take off 20 to 30 weeks while submitting their retirement applications, ensuring their benefits lasted longer during the calculation period. Although some did not take advantage of this, many did. Eventually, the company was sold because the owners recognized that their profitability would not extend beyond another 6 to 7 years, and they wished to exit the business due to their advancing age. New ownership, associated with a Coca-Cola subsidiary, took charge and began to eliminate the previous policies. At his level, there were 3 individuals: him, a second colleague, and a third. They dismissed the second and, shockingly, the third one suffered a heart attack just a week later. They proceeded to cut his salary by 15% because he was earning too much for a simple engineer. The 3 of them held patents for specialized machinery, one for the design of the equipment and another for the production process of a small yet vital component. The former owner had permitted them to register the patents when they invented a new manufacturing method that was 30% cheaper and 75% quicker several years prior. Suddenly, he found himself alone in this position at 64 while the company recruited 6 individuals for him to train. At the same time, they issued a deadline for the end of the year for all accumulated vacation time to be claimed, not used, just claimed. Over the past decade, he had taken between 1 and 5 weeks of vacation annually, which resulted in an accumulation of 87 weeks of time off, including the current year. But apparently, no one examined individual circumstances. They provided him with 6 new employees to train and mandated that he get them up to speed within 6 months, even though he still had 2.3 to 2.5 years remaining until his retirement. Consequently, he decided to take his 87 weeks of vacation, giving only 3 hours notice on a Friday evening, with the intention of starting the following Monday. No advanced notification was required. Management did not notice until the subsequent Thursday when the CEO observed the 6 individuals sitting around all day without any training. Phone calls commenced. Then emails. Letters were added to the mix, followed by home visits from junior secretaries to deliver the letters. Then, management showed up at his home. By the 7th week, the CEO had visited 3 times, but the door remained unopened. His mother-in-law lived directly across the street, an elderly woman, and both he and his wife took care of her, leading them to be over there most of the time and consistently aware of the visitors to their residence. Production continued to operate on its own, but maintenance on this critical aspect suffered. In the 11th week, he reported a breakdown in the first production line. Management began visiting his home 3 to 4 times a day. 2 weeks later, the second line malfunctioned. He had many friends in the company and received constant updates. At that point, they had only 4 weeks of backup stock to sustain production. In December, just before Christmas, he decided to return during week 13. He claimed he needed to retrieve some items from his locker, and the CEO began to yell at him, stating, "You are ending your time off immediately. You must return to repair everything." He offered to return for 3 days, provided that he would regain the entire week for vacation. Reluctantly, the CEO consented but also pressed him for training. Despite this, he held firm. He would only resolve outstanding issues and then return to vacation. By Saturday, everything was fixed, and he even left a few basic instructions on weekly maintenance. He was off again. Weeks passed, the new year arrived, and another line broke down. He was summoned back, with the CEO feigning that the previous agreement would still apply. He returned for 2 days, fixed the problems, provided additional guidance to the 6 members of the team who had since taken on other responsibilities. And just as he prepared to leave, the CEO stated, "Tomorrow at 8 a.m. The man replied in confusion, and the CEO explained, "You could have claimed your time off by the end of last year. You have just completed your claimed time off, meaning you are foregoing the remaining 69 weeks." He was furious and promptly reported the company to the Labor Rights Office. They were genuinely astonished by the amount of time off he had accumulated, prompting the woman assisting him to call her colleagues to listen in. They laughed uproariously at his story. Remarkably, a verdict was issued the very next day, which is unusual as it often takes weeks. They had simply found this case too entertaining. He was entitled to all of his accrued time off under the previous regulations for the time accumulated before the rule changes. Therefore, he was granted 69 weeks, although it should have been 70, counting the week he worked due to their agreement, which he lost, and an additional 6 weeks from the new year. He visited the CEO to personally deliver the decision, causing the CEO to fume with irritation. Ultimately, the CEO begrudgingly consented to his plan 3 days of work every 5 weeks of vacation. Should he be needed during his time off, that was too bad. They needed to focus on producing backup stock. A year passed this way, and he was now 66, gradually training the 6 employees every 5 weeks. During his final visit before taking the last 5 weeks off, the CEO personally handed him a termination notice effective on the first day back. He pretended to be shocked and left for another 5 weeks. This was problematic because applying for retirement early, even by 6 months, would significantly reduce his benefits, and he had about 10 months before retirement. His last 5 weeks expired, and when he returned to gather his belongings, only a coffee cup remained. He had anticipated this outcome and had taken everything over time. He received a significant severance payout for his unjust termination. The following day, he sent a cease and desist letter to the company regarding the use of the 3 patents. He had consulted with his dismissed colleague, who had agreed to this plan of retribution. He also coordinated with the widow of his deceased friend and co-worker, ensuring their support. He had been supporting the widow quietly, although he had not shared this with anyone. I only recently learned of it from the other colleague. Consequently, the company was required to halt the use of those machines and methods without notice. All competitors had already developed and patented their own versions, and if a solution was not found quickly, it would increase production costs by 40% and double the time required to produce the same component. This would necessitate doubling the lines if they reverted to the old methods while searching for alternatives. After just 3 weeks of unsuccessful negotiations with competitors for licensing the method, with stock levels becoming critically low, they struck a deal with him. He would operate as an external contractor, retaining the patents in his name, performing maintenance himself, receiving pay by the hour, equivalent to what he had previously earned in a full day, and remaining available for maintenance while ensuring someone was present for upkeep. He proceeded to recruit all 6 individuals he had trained and hired them at a higher salary than they had been earning in the factory. He quickly provided them with comprehensive training and was now earning a significantly higher income. The CEO was dismissed for nearly bringing production to a standstill. The agreement was reached mere hours before backup stock was exhausted and had cost the company a substantial amount of money by terminating him. During the old owner's funeral, many former employees gathered and shared their stories, revealing that there were 3 additional similar cases involving patent holders due to the old owner's excellent treatment of his team. However, he was the only one who managed to remain on vacation for nearly 2 years while still receiving pay. They all found it immensely entertaining, including the owner's widow and his sister, who were the other 2 partners in the factory before its sale.